Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's good to see people. It's getting late in the day, so it's nice to have you here. So my name's Greg Brail. I'm a software engineer at Google. I'm part of the Apigee team. That's how I came to Google back in November. And I've been working for as long as anyone can remember on APIs. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little about some of the aspects of APIs that makes developers want to use them. And then my colleague Prithpal is going to actually show how to do that via a live demo of Apigee Edge. And then Adam Brancato from Citrix is going to talk a little bit about his experiences with APIs and some of the things that they've done as well. So we're hoping that by the time we get to the end, we'll get an idea of what it looks like to actually create an API that a developer will want to consume and be able to consume. And then furthermore, we'll get some idea about how you can actually do that using products that you can use today. If anybody is interested and wants to learn even more about Apigee Edge, Prithpal and I are doing another session at 5:20 p.m. in the basement of the Marriott. It sounds very exciting to go there at that time. We'll be going into a much more detailed demo of all the aspects of Apigee Edge, including security and transformations and rate limits and stuff like that. So let me start out just for a few minutes to talk a little bit about APIs and why they're important and why we use them. How many of you work for companies or are in a position today where you're offering APIs to customers or third parties or even internally? Okay, that's a pretty good crew. That's awesome. So this may be preaching to the choir. Imagine if I asked you how many of you are using APIs, it's probably all of you. And you probably have opinions on what kind of APIs you like to use. But let's make sure that we make a little bit of time to understand why APIs. I won't spend a ton of time on this high-level stuff, but I wanted to set a little context. You know, obviously, today's world of digital business is built on APIs, and APIs are used in a lot of different contexts. You know, here we have an example of how, you know, one company could offer APIs that are used by customers, by partners, by employees, to host all kinds of backends for all kinds of things. And, you know, it's not really a surprise to us today that APIs are being used in a way that enables all kinds of interesting businesses. When we often talk about APIs with Apigee, we almost always start with this slide that we call the digital value chain. And it kind of shows all of the components of the API lifecycle, all the way from on the left, where we have actual end users, real people who use web apps and native apps and various devices that consume digital services. All the way on the right, we have the backends that actually host those APIs. Those backends could be brand new systems. You know, maybe you built something on App Engine or built it in Node and put it on Heroku or who knows what. They could also be legacy systems, as we saw in the keynote this morning, where they were taking a SOAP system and turning it into an API. And the stuff in the middle is what really connects everything together and makes the API real. And there are really two aspects to it. And I'm going to talk especially about the first aspect, which is connecting the developer, the person who builds the app that uses the API, with the API team. That's you folks who raised your hand earlier, the people who are offering the API. And that's really about how does a developer learn about the API and understand the API and get access to that API, and what are some of the best practices that make an API something a developer will really be excited about using rather than using because their boss told them they had to. At the same time, there's a technical component. How does the app actually connect to the API? How do we put in the right layers of security and traffic management, caching, and all the kinds of things that we need in order to take something that may be a back-end system that might be brand new, or might be a legacy system that wasn't designed to handle the volume or the complexity of the internet and of these connected devices. And for that, we have platforms like the Apigee API platform. And again, you know, our demo today will be focusing mainly on the developer consumption side, but we'll touch on some of those aspects as well. This digital value chain actually can go in either direction. You can start with sort of a SOA enterprise software world where you start with services that you want to expose and think about exposing them. But often it makes a lot more sense to start on the left. Think about what you want to offer to your customers. And then, by definition, what do you want to offer to developers? What do you think they want to use? And you can build your business. And it turns out, you may have seen this slide this morning, and also Ed Enough did a great presentation yesterday on this. There are actually a couple of different types of APIs, right? On the bottom, we have APIs that are services. These are the kind of APIs that if we're in enterprise computing today, if we ever had anything to do with SOA, even if we're talking about microservices, these are the kinds of APIs that as developers we're pretty comfortable with. It's an API that offers you a way to connect to some back-end service. And that's when we think about things like onboarding and governance. They're also on the left, however. APIs get used a lot, and get used a lot by Apigee customers, to enable interactions. So APIs that enable interactions are more about enabling mobile apps. And that's where we get to a case where there may be one API for all the apps in the world, or there may actually be lots of APIs that are customized for different platforms. This is something that companies like Netflix are known for doing at extremely large scale, where literally there's a different API for every type of device because we want that device to have the best possible user experience. And this is also where some new technologies like GraphQL come in that let a device customize the responses it needs for the best performance. And then finally, we have something that's starting to be a new thing for businesses that aren't in the technology business, which are APIs as products. Google's been offering APIs as products for a long time. The Maps API is very old, right? We have, and all the things that are part of Google Cloud are APIs that are offered as products. But now we're seeing more and more companies be able to offer where basically the API is the product, and the way that they make money is by monetizing consumption of the API. And these APIs fit into ecosystems. And an important thing to remember, I'm going to talk a lot about the API developer experience as if it's coming from that outer ring, the public ecosystems. These are the APIs that as developers you all know and understand. The Google Cloud APIs, the Twitter API, the Facebook APIs. And when people talk about APIs with Apigee, they often, especially a couple years ago, would start with the assumption that having an API means I have to offer an API to any developer in the world. But actually, the vast majority of these APIs are more on the internal part of this ring. They're used internally, either within an enterprise, or they're used by a company to support applications, such as mobile applications and web applications that the company builds. And we're seeing an increasing amount, and where the API economy really gets interesting is in the middle with these partner APIs and industry standard APIs. So where customers are now, when they used to, for instance, in financial services, communicate with trading partners and business partners and other businesses using a proprietary format like Fix or Swift, or FTPing files around, or mailing tapes to each other. Increasingly, those interactions are happening via API. And that's something we're going to talk about as well. So, most APIs, turns out, are actually internal. A minority of the APIs and a minority of the API traffic in the world are these public-facing external APIs that have the beautiful developer portals. So who cares if developers love them? So let me do a little bit of evangelism so you can at least go back and tell your friends why it's important that we pay attention to how the API presents itself to the developer. First of all, developers hate to waste time. That doesn't mean developers are lazy, but it means developers want to do things quick. So if a developer can pull up curl and test out your API, or if a developer can call your API from a Node.js application or an Android app or an iPhone app with just a few simple commands, they're going to be happy. If the developer's got to learn a complex proprietary SDK and some weird security protocol and wait for legal approval, they're not going to be happy. And if they have a choice of APIs, they might move away. Same thing happens especially for both internal and external developers. But if you think about partners, when you're offering an API to your business partners or to your customers as a business, in a business-to-business context, the thing that we sometimes hear, and always makes me kind of frustrated, is when people say, yeah, it doesn't really matter what our API looks like, because our customers have no choice but to work with it because we're huge company X or huge company Y. And the truth is that, yes, you can get away with a certain amount of that. But unless you can really make those APIs something developers will be happy to use, you've added a layer of friction to every interaction. Every sale, everything you do becomes that much harder if the developers are only using the APIs because they have no other choice. Successful companies that run API businesses, like Twilio, for instance, one of the reasons they succeed is because developers love to use their APIs. And they say, why do I have to go through all this complicated stuff to use the thing you made me use? Why don't we just use X? So let's talk about some of the aspects of great APIs. And this is kind of my list of 7 things, and I'm going to basically go through each one of them. But things like self-service and sign-up and documentation are tremendously important to API adoption. And if you look at the APIs that are very popular and used widely in the world, you'll see that each one of these does these in a very good way. And this is why we're going to just talk for a few minutes about what those things look like, and then Prithpal is going to come and show you how to do it. So we'll start with self-service. I think self-service is one of the most important aspects of APIs for developers. Obviously, if you want to offer an external API to thousands and thousands of developers like Google does, you have no choice but to have self-service. But increasingly, as APIs become what are used for business-to-business communications and are used inside a large organization, self-service becomes equally important. So many companies we talk to are in a world where, yeah, we have APIs, but to use them, you have to know the guy to call, and you have to go to the meeting, and you have to send an email, and then they type you into a database, and it takes 3 weeks. You know, this is slowing down your business. This is either slowing down your developers internally, or this is slowing down those partners and those customers who could be happily using those APIs. So I have some examples here. Walgreens, for instance, these are customers of Apigee who have produced APIs. They have great self-service developer portals where someone can come in and they can actually see what API is available. They can click a button, and ideally in a few minutes, they can get the security credentials they need to start using that API. Now, maybe those credentials don't let them do whatever they want. Maybe initially it's a sandbox, or there's a low rate limit. But you can get started quickly and learn the APIs. But very closely related to self-service is how you sign up for the API. So for instance, I was on this stage yesterday with Ismail from Ticketmaster. They have a great developer program. 10% of Ticketmaster's API traffic and ticket sales are now coming from third-party apps that were not built by Ticketmaster. And one of the reasons, and they achieved this in a pretty short time, and the reason they were able to do that, in part, of course, this is my biased view, is because their API is really simple for a developer to get started with. They have a great portal at developer.ticketmaster.com. You sign up, and if you look at this sign-up form, there's not a whole ton of information you have to give them. On the right, I pasted a sign-on form from Twitter. Similarly, yeah, there's a bunch of legal stuff at the bottom, and obviously as a developer you need to understand that, but they're not asking for your social security number or anything like that. In the old days, we used to see companies who would say, yeah, to use our API, you got to fill out this form and fax it back to our legal team, and it takes 2 weeks to review. You know, that's death for APIs, right? You want developers to be able to at least get started with those APIs as quickly as possible via self-service, and ideally manage the whole thing through self-service, even if approval is needed later on for higher tiers of API access or to get access to production data. Documentation is also tremendously important. The rise of formats like OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger, really helps with this because you can specify your API in a formal way using YAML, and there are a lot of great tools out there, including one in the Apigee Edge platform, that will make it easy for someone to visualize that API and learn that API quickly. So for instance, here we have PayEasy, also the Nest API. These are just some examples of APIs that have really nice, clear online documentation. And it's not just having good documentation that's there. Well, okay, I'm going to talk about, I thought I was going to get to the next slide. I'll come back to that. But documentation is important, but automatic testing is important. But I'll take a detour as a sec and talk about not only how the API is documented, but how it's designed. We could do a whole hour-long session on API design and have a lot of fun, and we've done it before, and perhaps we should. The truth is that there are a couple of different strands of thought, and there are different opinions out there, and people have very passionate arguments. But the thing that I've noticed is always clear is that every developer I've worked with understands what they don't like. So this slide actually comes from an old chestnut of an Apigee presentation from Brian Malloy about, hey, here's kind of like the bad way to do it. And this is how we might do it if we were just programming in a programming language, or even using SOAP, right? You start out with get dog and get location, but before long you've got get recurring dog walk schedule and replace sitting dogs with running dogs. And you've made an API that requires developers, they can't make a single API call without going through every line of your documentation very carefully and understanding how to do it. And furthermore, your API is unlike every other API in the world, so they have to do a whole bunch of research just to make a single API call, right? At the same time, there are a lot of API design mechanisms that developers do understand. If I go in front of a developer and say, we have an API that is what is usually referred to as REST, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what different people think the words REST mean, but if I say that my API consists of a bunch of URIs and a bunch of verbs, and that to create something, you post to a URI, and to get information about it, you do a get on that same API, and to a delete it, URI, and to delete it, you do a delete on that same API. Pretty much every developer will understand what I'm talking about. Furthermore, if I say, okay, then there's a whole hierarchy of URIs, and they're documented in this document like the one we saw a little while back, almost every developer will know how to use it. And if I say, and by the way, the thing that you send back and forth to my API is JSON, every developer will know how to use that, and every platform in the world, except for some reason Java, has JSON built in. So they all know how to work with it, right? So these are the kinds of things that works. On the other hand, there are some new things coming along that are sort of additional quivers in your arrows in your quiver. For instance, RPC, represented by Google's gRPC, is a very interesting tool to use for APIs that are very performance critical, where you have a pretty good idea what the shape of the API is, and it's not going to change very often. Similarly, GraphQL is sort of a way that uses that same URI and JSON and verb mechanism, but it allows a client to specify exactly what it wants from the API, potentially combining many API call responses into one. And then finally, there's hypermedia, which when used carefully can make it much easier for a developer to consume an API, because every API response has some URLs in it, and all the developer's got to do is follow that URL to get more information about that resource and understand what it can be done. And like I said, there's a ton of stuff out there, but the basics are, if you do what other people are doing and follow the patterns that developers understand, then there's very little friction. I did a whole presentation yesterday on security, and we're going to keep the security part real short here. But basically, just like API design, there are security techniques and standards that everyone understands. APIs that need to authenticate end users, meaning like I need access to my bank account, OAuth has become the de facto standard. OAuth provides a number of ways that an API client can exchange some security credentials for a token, and that token is now authorized to do only certain actions on behalf of one and only one user on one and only one device. Furthermore, it expires all the time, so you have to keep refreshing it, right? It's become the de facto standard, and there are a lot of ways to use it. Similarly, for APIs that don't require an end user to be authenticated, such as store location APIs, for instance, having a very simple mechanism like an API key that allows you to at least understand which application is making an API call, even though the end user doesn't have to be authenticated, is also a very important part of effective API management. These are things everyone understands. Making up your own thing, hey, I have a new security mechanism, I have a proprietary token format, download this little bit of Java and put it in your client, and we won't tell you what it does, but we promise it's okay. Those things make it harder for people to adopt your API. And then finally, I'll talk about a few other things. And now we've done the basics, right? We've got a well-designed API, we've got the right security mechanism, we've got self-service onboarding, we've got great documentation. You can stop there and you've got an API that developers will find it very easy to work with. But most APIs that are very widely adopted these days also come with a set of SDKs. So for instance, I pasted a screenshot from the Google Cloud APIs, where for the Google Cloud has a big SDK for many of the cloud APIs. And as you can see, they have SDKs in all the major languages. Not only that, right there, they link you not only to basically how to get the binaries for your various platforms, but also here's the link to the GitHub repo. So if you have an issue with the SDK, you can understand what it does. You can compile it yourself if you don't trust it. By the way, at Google, we don't trust anything, so we compile everything ourselves. You can understand the license, and you can submit pull requests to it if it doesn't do something that you need or you don't like the way it was structured. Furthermore, if you designed your API the way I just talked about, the SDK is not a requirement. A real anti-pattern in the world is having an API that only works with the SDK, because the data format is proprietary, it's really weird to use, it uses some weird binary protocol like a database, right? You can't use Oracle without the Oracle client, and who knows what that thing is doing, right? But if you're working with an open API that's well designed, a developer doesn't have to use the SDK, but if you provide them with SDKs for various platforms, you make them open source. It's a lot easier for developers to feel good about your code if it's open source, especially if they're going to put it in their proprietary native app. Now you've made things easier for developers, you've made them happy, and they're more productive. And sort of a little bit more state of the art is more and more APIs now are able to offer live testing. they're actually able to not only combine that API documentation, but with the ability from within your web browser to actually test API calls and learn how they work. You can try out different parameters, you can see what the JSON looks like, you can figure out how to parse it. The more complex an API gets, the more cool it is to be able to actually test that API. So for instance, PayEasy on the right has a whole mechanism for that. I was looking at Ticketmaster, they have it as well, right? Really simple APIs, curl is fine, but it's really nice for a developer to say, oh, here are the docs for your API. You can have a button right there that says try it, and now you've made life a lot easier for your developers. So with that said, I'm now going to go on to how you do this yourself, and Prithpal from the Apigee team is going to come up and give you guys a demo.
Thanks, Greg. Can we switch to the demo, please? Awesome. All right, so somehow I'm confined to this desk today so that I can talk on the microphone and you guys can hear me. But I'll try my best to kind of hand wave because I usually like to move around quite a bit. Just a quick show of hands out here. How many of you folks in attendance have actually worked with or used or seen a developer portal before? Okay, quite a few. Thanks, Greg. So as Greg touched on some very important things up front, the adoption of your APIs is one of the most important things, right? Who cares if you have good APIs and if they're not adopted, you really don't make too much out of it. So in this session, in this segment, I'm going to focus on what really makes for an awesome API developer experience, primarily for the app developer audience who is tasked with building apps, right? So in this case, I'm going to leverage the backdrop of Fazio, who's an online shoe retailer. We'll use this as an example. And in my role, pretend I'm a partner developer. So Fazio happens to be selling shoes online, and they have a very broad channel ecosystem. So you have a lot of different partners who can essentially leverage the Fazio APIs and build their own apps to sell Fazio products, okay? So just as in your own experience today, if you're using a mobile app, and if you spend more than 4 to 6 seconds on the very first page of your mobile app, chances are you're going to the App Store to look for another app. Something very similar is happening in the API arena. As Greg mentioned, if they have a choice, and many of them do, an app developer is going to go to another API very quickly if they can understand what the API does. Okay? So let's examine the journey of me as a partner developer trying to see how I can build an app. So I come to the Fazio developer portal here. I can see some simple graphics around what Fazio does. More importantly, I can see 3 high-level classifications: product APIs, location APIs, fulfillment APIs. You can see that I'm not signed in, so my experience is a little bit different. I do have access to some things known as forums, which will give me some more insight into what are people generally doing with these APIs, right? So think about the experience of me trying to register, and I want access to some of the API documentation so I can build an app and incorporate some of the order APIs within my ecosystem. So it's a very simple registration process. I can just go enter my first name, give it a username, email, answer a basic math question, and then create an account. In this case, I actually already have an account, so I'm going to sign in out here. And they happen to have different kinds of roles which are supported out here. So assuming the demo gods are with us, and that I can answer the basic math question correctly, this should let me in. Great. So I just logged in as a developer. Okay? I created an account, I logged in, and you can see my choices open up. I have access to the API catalog. One of the most simplest things that I want to do as an app developer is for me to be able to browse the API documentation and get to the orders API. When I come into the API catalog section, you can see that I can see a bunch of different APIs out here around customer, authentication. Let's just unselect all of them and just click on orders. One of the things which Greg had also mentioned was APIs as products. This is another example of how Fazio is now trying to offer their APIs as products which can be consumed by their channels, by the partner ecosystem. So let's take a look at the Fazio Orders Gold tier. And this just uses a different mechanism where you can subscribe to more number of API calls if you were to pick a silver option or a regular option. So great. The next task I want to do is I want to try and create an app by which I can place an order on the Fazio API. So when I come to the Orders API page, you can see that they've done a fantastic job of clearly documenting how do I create an order, get an order, cancel an order, so on and so forth. Becomes very simple for me to imagine how to use this. So let's go click on the Create Order. And again, this is not a developer portal where you have a link to an API documentation which you can go download and use some testing tool. This offers inline testing for me. So as the app developer, I have signed into the Fazio developer portal, and I'll do a live API testing here without presenting any other tool. So on the Create Order, I can see that I have a good amount of help if I need to explain what each and every field does. More importantly, they've already put in a very simple test payload. Okay? You can see that this API is protected. I've already set the OAuth credentials. If not, you can click on this button, sign in, and it will already attach an OAuth token for you. Okay? So it's a very simple submit order request. And if I go down here and click on the send test request, it sent this order in, and I got a 200 OK, right? Couple clicks, I went into the API catalog, was able to look at the Create Order API. I know the payload, I clicked it, I'm good. So that's one aspect of my app experience, right? It looked like a pretty simple API. So great, how do I get started? Greg also mentioned about how do you really eliminate the friction? Do you really want to be able to have this developer send in a request so they can get their own API keys to access the API over a fax machine and wait to get an approval 2 weeks back? That's certainly going to just throw this developer away. Looks like the developer portal provides a much more simpler mechanism to do that. So they have the My Apps section here. I'm going to click on this, and as you can see, this developer has already done some stuff in the past. I'm going to just say, I want to register a brand new app. So let's call this thing my first shoe ordering app. Okay? And I'm going to pick this orders product. An API product is nothing but a mechanism. It's a grouping of certain APIs which are available at a specific price point or at a specific volume metric. So let's go and do this and click Create App. So using this as an app developer, I've just asked for access to the Orders API. And you can see that out here, I can see the status as pending, right? So as a developer, I'm just waiting to get access to this. I've initiated a request. Now let's hop over to the provider side. This is the approval side of the house. This is the product manager who'd be sitting on the side trying to approve any app requests which come in. So let's take a quick peek at that. So in this case, I'm logged into the Apigee Edge user interface, which is the portal that the providers are going to be using. So in this case, I go on the publish icon, click on the apps link, and let's just type in the word shoe. Fair enough, I can see the My First Shoe Ordering app, which has been requested to be created and given permission to by this new app developer. Within the app details section, you can see it shows that it's in a pending status. So I'm going to click on Edit, and I'm going to approve this app right here. Let's go ahead and save this. Just in a couple of clicks, I've been able to approve the app. And if I'm an app developer, I can now see that this app is approved. So what happened when we did that? Well, let's take a look. As part of the app approval process, I actually now have my own set of consumer key and secret that I can actually use to securely call this API, right? This is very important. There was no human involved. Well, from a provider perspective, you can automate that kind of approval. There could be certain other APIs that you may provision for which it gets auto-approved, right? So that's very typical of many customers who may do that for some low-risk APIs or where they do not need any kind of oversight. And then I, as a developer, can go and take a look at different pieces of the apps. When I start to work with some of the app calls that I make over time, it will also surface some of the analytics that are useful for me as an app developer, not from the enterprise, but to get a sense of how much does this app kind of bring up. Okay, so let's do something real quick out here. I'm going to show the provider side of the house and talk about one simple aspect of how does this app, how does the API provider essentially ensure that this app is not abusing the API, okay? So in this case, I could go on the create order and pretend this app, for some reason, was not designed with the right intent. And you can see that I can continue to just pound on it a few times, and I can still submit a lot of requests, right? On the API provider side, there are some very quick checks and balances that you can take. In this case, I need to ensure that this API is protected, okay? So let's take a look at this underlying API proxy. An API proxy is nothing but a facade. That is the thing which actually sits in between the consumer of the app, of the API, and the actual API itself. And that's where all the magic happens. You have a lot of different policies that you can drop in out there to enable protection. So in this case, I'm going to do something very simple. I'm going to attach a spike arrest policy. A spike arrest policy is something very simple. All it does is, once you create that, you can see me adding a live policy out here. In this policy, I can configure the rate at which I want to limit all the API calls coming into this API proxy, okay? And the idea is, I want to protect my backend API from crashing and burning if any app goes rogue for some odd reason, okay? So I've added a very simple spike arrest policy, which in this case happens to be 3 requests to that API per minute, okay? So let's see the effect of what happens out here. So if I'm within my limits, it's going to work just fine. But if the app starts to grow a little bit more crazy, you can see that it throws a spike arrest violation right about here, okay? So hopefully that gave you a good taste of what the app developer experience is. We looked at how things can be provisioned in a way so you cut all the friction with app developers. They can adopt your APIs. You also have some tools on the provider side to be able to protect your APIs from intentional or unintentional kind of attempts. And I would like to now welcome, if you can go back to the slides, please. I would like to welcome on the stage Adam Brancato from Citrix.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Brancato. I am the manager of customer applications at Citrix. So basically what that means is my department is in charge of all the applications and services that deal with customer accounts, contact information, single sign-on, etc. So real quick, let me explain to you guys who Citrix is for anyone that doesn't know. Our products and services, they focus on unifying apps and data in secure digital workspaces that enable users to work remotely from anywhere on any device. We have a couple products that support this. We have our Zen App and Zen Desktop products, which are application and desktop virtualization products. We also have ShareFile, for example, which is our enterprise file storage, file sharing, etc. Actually, we just recently released a beta that actually integrates with G Suite. Then we have a couple appliance products such as NetScaler, it's load balancing, firewall products, etc., as well as Internet of Things products. So I'm going to talk to you today about the Citrix API journey, where we began, where we are now, how we got started with Apigee. So as Greg talked about, a lot of times you have these internal services that are not very easy to expose, or whenever people want to use these services, they have to jump through a lot of hoops. And that's kind of how it started at Citrix. So we had several other departments. There's a lot of different IT departments and IT groups at our company. We have like 9,000 employees. So I'm sure anyone in medium to large company knows what it's like with multiple IT groups. Well, our group is the keeper of the data for accounts, contacts, single sign-on, all those items that I mentioned earlier. So a lot of them wanted access to this. Well, a lot of our systems are written in legacy SOAP services, for example. We have a lot of WCF, .NET services. And some of these newer applications are front-end, JavaScript, Angular, etc., that really don't play well with SOAP. Or the way the system was set up, it's not very easy to give you access. If you're like, hey, can I have access to this account service? I'm like, sure. Give me 3 days to reach out to the network guys to get your account provisioned. And then, oh, by the way, here's this really crazy WSDL that you have to use if you want to, just get Bob's account information from his email address. So at Citrix, we were looking for a way, both internally and externally, to allow developers, partners, vendors to access this information without having to jump through all of these hoops, because it provides a bad bad service experience like Greg had talked about. So we researched several different API platforms, and we decided on Apigee. We created a simple POC in order to check out the features, make sure these guys knew what they were really talking about, and if it would be something that would be a good fit for Citrix. And we decided to move forward with that. Now in production, we have over 20 APIs. You can see them listed up here. We have single sign-on, account APIs, contacts, support cases. There's actually a Salesforce API you see listed. That's interesting. Behind the scenes, that's not even our service. So we use Salesforce for our CRM system, and they have SOAP services that allow us to access our customer data. So we put API management, Apigee, on top of that in order to expose that data out. And like I said, all of our APIs, they're used both internal and external. And it's a simple platform. So the developers consuming them, internal, external, they love it. We give them a key, we sign them up. It's real quick and simple, and they're off the ground running in a very, very short amount of time. And then our internal developers who are actually, configuring Apigee in these services, it's real simple to use. It's easy to issue keys. It's easy to do a lot of different things. So I'm going to talk about Citrix is one of our first big use cases that we had. So to give you a little bit of background, excuse me, we have an e-commerce platform that we're using to sell product to small businesses and also issue trials. One of the problems with this was that for the license keys, they had to be uploaded manually by the business. And anytime we'd run out of stock on one, someone would get an email saying, hey, Zen Desktop, we're out of product keys. And someone would have to go and upload new ones. And those were generated internally, and it was not a simple process. So the business came to us and said, hey, is there a better way that we can do this? Right? Because this was almost, one person's full-time job to manage these product keys and upload them, because we had something like 50 different products in the store, 50 different SKUs at least. So that was our first use case, right? And this vendor said, oh, we have a system where we can make calls after the order is complete. We're like, great, that's terrific. However, here is this crazy schema that we're going to send you, and you have to use this schema and accept it. And that's how it is. Just like Greg was saying, they're big enough. They're like, hey, here's our contract. You have to abide by it. So we didn't want to do that, and Apigee was the perfect solution to this problem. So if you look up here on this next slide, you can see how our solution was actually set up. So at the bottom, you could see the external e-commerce site. They send us their custom ridiculous schema. We transform that, and then we send it over to, you could see the Citrix licensed WCF service. That's a legacy.NET service that's been around at the company for quite some time. So to expose that, all we had to do was configure Apigee, create an XSLT that I created, and it takes only the values that are needed for the service, sends it to the service brings back the SOAP response, converts it back into the vendor schema, and sends it off. Then once we had that up and running, our trials team heard about this and said, wow, they said, you guys have an API now? We'd love to use that. However, the trials team, as you'll see in a bit when I show you guys a demo, they have just a simple front-end site, and they have some front-end JavaScript developers, and they need that information in REST. And we said, that's great. Here you guys go. Now there's a REST front-end on it as well that's returning JSON. Does the same thing. It hits the same service on the back end, but on the front end, it's real easy for these guys to use. They send us the information in JSON. We create the license key and send it back. And then finally, we have SOAP consumers who just send us the actual schema that our service uses, and we send them back their keys in that format. So we have one back-end service that's exposed over 3 different protocols. When we deployed all of these different solutions, there was no back-end service change needed. All of this was done through configuration on the Apigee side. Very simple to use. Developers were like, here's your key, here you go, and they're off and running. So just to show you real quick, I don't even know if you guys can read this, but on the left-hand side, you could see that vendor schema, and that's not pretty. That's what our vendor said, here you go write a service that takes it. We didn't want to have to deal with that, and you can see that there's a scroll bar up there, so that's not even their entire schema. They send every single piece of information they have about the order. On the right-hand side, you see our Citrix schema, which is only about 8 to 10 different inputs, a couple different SKUs, and they're off and running, and that's it. So Apigee really helped us move from this crazy schema to our simple schema, send it to the back end, and then also on the trial side, those guys just send us JSON, and we convert it to what the schema you see here, and it gives them the result they're looking for. So real quick, I'm going to show you guys something. Can we switch? There we go. So as much as I'm sure Prithpal would love if I messed with his account, I'm going to log out of his account real quick. Yeah, no problem. And then I'm going to sign into my account. Cool. So looks like it did not like that. There we go. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to open up our proxy. And I'm going to go to the Trace tab real quick. So this was actually shown this morning for the keynote, for anyone that was there. This is actually the Apigee trace screen. So what this allows you to do is this allows you to run a live trace and watch an API call as it comes through, inspect the data, and see what's going on if there's any kind of problems. As developers, we really like that because if one of our end users reports a problem, this makes it very easy to determine if it's something in the Apigee configuration or if it's something in our back-end service. We can inspect the data, see what's going on. So I'm going to start that real quick in this tab. And then over here, I'm going to go to citrix.com. I'm going to go to downloads, and I'm going to click free trials. So I'm going to choose let's go with Zen app. And then I'll click download now. So we'll start off. There's actually 4 APIs that our trial department is using here, all in this one page. So the first thing we have here is says, enter your email address, and we will send you, your trial license. So I enter my email address, and this is where the first API call takes place. What it's doing is it's checking, it's calling the API and saying, hey, does Adam Brancato have an account with us? And it did. It found my account. If it didn't find my account, what it would have done is instead it would have displayed a different screen which has, very compact number of fields to create a new account. The trials department, they said, we don't want to direct somebody all the way to the site, to go through the full account screen because that's potentially going to deter them from coming back and downloading the product. So instead, they created a compact screen here if they don't have an account. So I'm going to log in and pretend that I've read and accepted the end user license agreement and hit send license. So now what this is doing, if we go over to this tab here, everything's working as expected. We should see this call come through, and there it is. So this is actually in progress. As it's creating the key, it's going out to the back-end service. This lags a bit behind on what's going on. And then you can see here that it says, hey, here's your license key, and it's created my free trial. So let's go back real quick, and we could take a look at what's going on. So basically what Apigee allows you to do is, in real time, we can take a look at this request. This is where it verified our API key that we use to send it. Then there's some basic authentication shapes in here where we inject some values into the request before we send them off to our actual back-end service. And then on the bottom here, anything up top here is the request pipeline before it's called our service, and then down here is the response pipeline, everything that gets executed on the way out. And there's error checking in there, formatting, etc. Makes it very easy to see what's going on inside of your APIs as they're executing. And if we go here, this is the XML to JSON shape. And you could see here's the JSON that's returned. If we go back one shape, you could see here's the, visible up there, sort of. You could see here's the XML. It's kind of what they showed in the keynote earlier. This is actually the response from the server in SOAP format, but we convert it over to that JSON format that we send back. Very useful. One of the last things I'll show you is analytics and reporting. So one of the features that we find extremely useful is Apigee has a great number of built-in reports. So if we go to reports. So by default, Apigee is going to give you proxy performance, for example. It's going to give you a bunch of default numbers. I got to change the date because this is an older environment. There we go. This will just give you things like average server response time, amount of traffic that came through the proxy, et cetera, et cetera. And you could see that, for example, for this period we had 2.3 million calls. This is all great. But every so often, you need some of your own custom analytics. All right, we had a problem a couple months ago where one user, for example, was causing a lot of traffic on our one proxy, and we needed to know exactly which user that was. So, and those built-in reports, they give you high-level overall the total number. So what we needed is traffic by the proxy and by the operation. So we created this very simple custom report. This took all of about 15 minutes maybe to create. And you can see this gives us here a quick drill down into, okay, over that time period, here's all the different services that were called, but we wanted more. We wanted to know exactly which operations and who was calling that because we had someone that was causing a heavy load. So through this custom report, it's very simple to take, for example, the contact service, click on that, and this is going to show me, okay, here's all the different operations. Here's the different paths. And then I could take like the person details, for example. I click on that, and now it's going to tell me, okay, here's the CWC Control Center and Control Center V2. That's, where the majority of your traffic is. And this report also, it's funny that they are listed here, is actually, they wanted us to give them a new API key. They said, we don't want to use the old API key anymore. Can you give us a new one? We said, sure, that's not a problem. They said, can you turn off the old one? We said, we can, but are you sure that none of your other applications are using it? And they said, oh, yeah, you can turn it off. Nobody's using it. We ran this report, and they were wrong. We said, no, if you look right here, you could see, V2, you have 1,100 calls, for example, or whatever it was, and here you have 56,000. So this really helps validate a lot of data, examine your traffic, and see what's going on. So lastly, can we switch back to the slides? Cool. So overall, I just want to talk to you in general about a lot of the benefits that we at Citrix find from the Apigee solution. Consistent APIs is a facade to disparate backgrounds. I already showed you guys we have a whole lot of SOAP services, and then we have a lot of new services that are web API services, etc. So Apigee allows us to use them to sit on top, call out to these different services, and expose them over whatever protocols that we want. In fact, one of our services is a single sign-on service that we have that gives out tokens. Several third parties and vendors use this to authenticate against the Citrix, users. And they said, well, is there a way we can also get, like someone's first name, last name, and about 5 or 6 other pieces of information? So we have a second single sign-on API that actually authenticates and at the same time calls another service, but combines all that data into one response. We didn't have to write additional services on the back end. All we had to do was configure Apigee to say, hey, make a call out to the second service. And Apigee, they allow us to have our developers focusing on actually writing these back-end services as opposed to, okay, now I have to figure out a new security implementation like Greg was talking about, or if I wanted to consume that schema I showed you guys a couple slides ago, I wouldn't want to be the guy that had to do that. Apigee also, they took away our need to have to manage these users. We manage them now through the Apigee system. Before, we had to create Active Directory accounts in some situations. In others, there was databases of passwords, and canceling one was a whole other hassle. Apigee's like, we got it. We'll take care of it for you. Makes it easy for us, and much, much easier for developers and consumers, because it's easier for them to get on board and working in a couple minutes almost. Lastly, they can secure and obfuscate data for us. You guys didn't see it in this service, but we have a vendor ID that we need in our back-end service, and it would be really silly for me to say to you as an end user, hey, your ID is 12345, please send me that in every request. So what we can actually do is we associate it with their API key inside of Apigee. When Prithpal was showing you guys the screen where he was approving the developer, there were some key value pairs at the bottom. So we set that up in there so the end user actually doesn't need to know that value. We pull it from their developer object inside of Apigee. And finally, I showed you guys it has traffic management where we can see what's going on the different servers, and we can run reports, analytics, and see everything that's going on from the Apigee side with our APIs. So on that note, I'd like to bring Greg back up, talk about a couple last-minute things.
Yeah, I think I have 1 or 2 last-minute points. We're almost out of time. First of all, as we saw, Adam did a great job of showing, real-life production traffic, which I thought was awesome. There's no fakery there at all, and I really appreciated that. But really, consistent message here. Think about developers. Put yourself in the shoes of your developers and build APIs that you think they're going to want to do. Many people, sometimes they question the value of self-service. But we just saw an example of where by enabling self-service for developers, Citrix is able to make things a lot more efficient internally. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for staying around the conference, and we'll see you all later.